Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 2-minute voting feature interview, part of our energy transition dialogues. And we're delighted to have with us this week, featuring in the interview, Ms. Liz Hovem, the CEO of DNVGL Oil and Gas. So thank you very much, Liv, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I suppose we haven't spoken in the last few months, and I have to put my first question to you, which is obviously what we've seen happen this year in the pandemic, and get your opinion or DNVGL's take on how you see COVID-19 and the economic impact of that has so far impacted the progression of the energy transition.
That's a very interesting question, and we have studied that through the lenses of our energy transition outlook model. And what we have seen is that the COVID has, due to behavioral changes, less travel, less commute, work from home, we've seen that the energy demand is reduced about 8% this year. And we also think that the COVID will have some lasting effects on our travel habits and our working habits and all that. So we see that all the way through to our 2050, which is our kind of forecasting period. Mm-hmm. We will see that the energy demand will be 6 to 8% lower than in our previous forecast. So it will have an effect, definitely, on the demand.
Clearly it has impacted immediate demand, and the recovery of that obviously is in question, and how when that will happen. Obviously, it's reflected partially in the oil price and what we're seeing there as well. But in terms of its impact on investment confidence, if you like, on the projects that are already in play towards the energy transition, whether it's new energy and renewables, or whether it's the sort of decarbonizing of traditional energy sources. A lot of people have argued, well, this has kind of refocused companies and governments thinking on climate change and the challenges that we're facing there. And that also it's proven that, well, when cash is needed, the government can make it available for certain things. So, we've heard different opinions on whether it's been positive or negative for investment into the current projects in energy transition. If we look at the Middle East, do you feel that it's had a stymieing effect on the commitment there?
So when we see the effect on the energy demand, of course that means first and foremost on the oil demand that has gone down, and we actually think that peak oil is behind us, and that going forward there will be many stimulus packages towards the energy transition, more electrification, more renewables. But we do still see that there are investments going into the traditional oil and gas industry, but the uncertainty regarding those investments and whether they will come through has increased. Having said that, when we say that we have peak oil behind us, we think that there will be more focus on cheap oil. And then looking at the Middle East portfolio, we do see that the Middle East will have an advantage in the years to come with respect to cost, so that Middle East and North Africa will remain one of the big oil producers times ahead. That's what we see in our model.
Okay, I mean, and if we just look at renewables, and we'll go back to sort of oil and gas, but on the renewables front, obviously we've seen the cost of production obviously come down dramatically in the last few years thanks to technology, and we've seen some of the Gulf countries very successful in taking that on, and in terms of the solar energy. Do you see that trend continuing, if you like, or does the Middle East need to continue to balance, obviously, investment in its traditional bread and butter and new energy? Where's the balance there for Middle Eastern governments and the GCC in particular, in terms of the best winning position that they could put their bets on?
So we forecast that there will be a tremendous electrification going on, so that in 2050, more than 40% of all energy will be carried by electricity, whereas now it's like 19%. We also forecast that most of that electricity will be generated by renewables, so wind and solar. And that is extremely important. There will be an extreme growth in that area, as you say. But of course, having said that, our forecast also shows that the climate goals will not be reached. Even though we have that growth in renewables, there will still be such a large part of the energy system that will be provided by fossil fuels. So I think for all countries, regardless of whether they have more or less sources of fossil fuels or renewables, a dramatic need for decarbonization is needed. So to use, for example, as I said, most likely the Middle East will continue to be producing oil for very, very many years ahead. There is a need to decarbonize and to decarbonize production, and one way to do that is electrification of the assets.
Yeah,
and there I see that that's an opportunity, right? You have plenty of sun, generate electricity, electrify the production, and then export.
Yeah, and
so
of course
I think you were talking both, right? Both.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Yeah. And the electrification through renewable, and also you've got obviously technologies like carbon capture storage, which obviously help to clean the CO2 and obviously help. So the balance of the two, clearly. Do you think that, I mean, obviously the technology is there, R&D is being invested in it. A lot of people say that the tech is there, it's available. Most of it is commercially viable, some of it is still in the development phase. But is policy in this region keeping up with that advantage? I mean, do you think that on the policy front, we have they're keeping up essentially with the technology on offer, or are they still sort of playing catch up with that? And what is it that will bring those two together?
The dramatic uptake of renewables, which still need to happen, that is to some degrees driven by very good policies that have kind of started on this cost reduction curve. We saw that especially in Europe, that incentivized the use of PV and wind. And I think the challenge now is really to have policies that can bring forward the technologies that decarbonize the difficult to abate sectors. So you mentioned CCS. Yes, the technology is there, but it's still quite costly. So in order for that to scale, it has to have a push or a pull from policies so that the cost can come down and then eventually be taking more in use. So extremely important that the policy and some countries move ahead in this aspect.
Yeah, and what about one policy that we've seen progress in one or two countries in Europe and not in others, and is this price on carbon and how far countries or regions are pushing that, as everyone would agree probably is only one of many solutions that need to happen. But even on its own, as a standalone, do you see that being implemented at all in this region? And then, I mean, is it realistic to think that they would even be able to set a price on carbon here, given the infrastructure that's already traditionally embedded in the Middle East?
So ideally, that would be the best measure, right? That you pay to pollute, and then that money has gone back to kind of clean the energy system. That would be the best way. Realistically, I mean, we haven't seen much of that yet, and we're not terribly optimistic about that in our energy model either. So I think that there has to be more direct, incentives or being mandatory made, or different measures on that point. But ideally, absolutely, the carbon price would make a huge impact.
And I mean, I mean, the company, your DNV has talked about, obviously in its various reports in the last year, also obviously battery power, electric vehicles, etc. I mean, as one arm of decarbonizing the atmosphere, if you like. And I think one thing that you have mentioned before is that we need to be, significantly increasing the manufacture of EVs. The argument for that is still there, but this year, as hydrogen has suddenly come front and center, some people saying, well, actually EVs all well and good, but what about the battery disposal and the climate effect of that? How about we start to focus our attention more on hydrogen, not of course just for cars, for industry as well. Battery versus clean hydrogen, on where those two can be applied. What would you say the pros and cons of that are at the moment?
I think that to achieve the Paris climate goals, we need all that there is. So we need both the electrical vehicles and the batteries, and we need the hydrogen. And they're not necessarily competing either. The electrical vehicles, they are replacing the use of oil. For heavier goods, maybe hydrogen is a good solution, and also for shipping, which is a hard to abate sector. So I think hydrogen is extremely important as well, and we see in our model that currently the share of hydrogen in the system in 2050 will be quite modest, so 13%. We do see that there are also big regional differences depending on the policies that are put into place so far. But we do see that in order to reach climate goals, we really have to fast forward the decarbonization of the gas, especially, and then we can use the gas for heavy industry, for heavy shipping, heavy goods transport, and these kind of things. So I don't think it's an either or necessarily. It's a both.
And what about nuclear? Again, we've got obviously 1 or 2 new plants in the region here that have launched recently in the last couple of years. Nuclear went off the grid for a while, if you like, but there has been a resurgence and interest, and again, as one of many solutions. Is that, do you think, something that should be pursued in parallel along with the other solutions that we're looking to reduce emissions?
So in the model that we have, it's kind of a cost model, in the sense that we think in the longer run it will be the most cost competitive technologies and hence energy sources that win towards the end. And nuclear on a global scale comes out a little bit, on the costly side, and that's why we don't see a big uptake of nuclear. Could be still reasons for some country to rely on nuclear, because our model doesn't really take into account issues such as geopolitics or energy security and all that, and also what the resources a country would have in country. So there could be reasons for it, but in the overall cost picture of the energy system, we don't see that will win in the longer run.
Yeah, and as you said, it is a sort of geopolitical investment, if you like, sort of power, if you like, on the energy space and otherwise. I wanted to ask you about energy grids, because obviously a lot of both on the renewable front and traditional electricity as well, there's been many arguments that well, if only regions would really focus on trying to get their grids better connected, etc., in order to sort of bring about efficiencies. We've seen relatively little progress on that front over the years, geographically here and perhaps in smaller sort of regions elsewhere. Where's the impetus going to be found for that? How are we going to be able to reinforce energy grids around the world so that progress is made on that?
This is not something that is really my expertise, the grid side on electricity, but I guess that's also part of the cost. And if you sit there and have to make the investments decision, and then you see all the various new energy sources coming, you have the traditional sources and you have the coal and LNG, so it's kind of where to put the bet. So I think that the recent years, actually, there has been a little bit kind of sitting on the fence type of attitude also before you kind of decide what grid to invest in. I mean, if hydrogen wins through, there is also a lot needed to be done on repurposing gas grids to take up all the renewable electricity. Obviously, a huge investment is needed, and then something to balance the whole grid in itself is also needed. So, I think again, sorry about that, little boring, but it has to be about new investments in the electricity grid and making sure that the traditional gas grid still works. Yeah.
And we mentioned I mean, we mentioned carbon pricing for industries and how much progress that's made in terms of on the sort of controlling the emissions on that front. What about the demand side of things, i.e. consumption? I mean, this, you know, in terms of controlling consumption, if you like, okay, you could argue this year we haven't had to control, we've had actually a surge in electricity consumption because people have been at home and there's been certain sectors that have needed more of that. And of course, the oil industry the demand has dropped dramatically. But in terms of controlling consumption in the interim in certain regions and taking measures like removing subsidies on certain things or taxing industry on others, are we seeing, do you think, enough measures on the policy front to disincentivize use of energy where it's not needed?
I think that's an extremely good question, both to disincentivize where it's not needed and also to make sure that energy efficiency really get the attention it needs, because there still is a lot, waste on the energy side. And I don't think there is done far enough there, both on the awareness side, so people need to be aware. And then it's of course about using electricity, so pricing it in such a way that you don't use it when you don't need it. So energy efficiency is still a huge potential to reach the climate goals. And there are also, I think, incentives to kind of guide and nudge human behavior could be very helpful.
And we've had a few sessions on digitalization. Role that plays obviously in systems in terms of helping with efficiencies and obviously cutting costs at the end of the day, which every company is after. Do you see again enough uptake there on the benefits that would bring? You know, obviously data sits within that, and there's nobody would argue against the fact that, you know, not enough is being made use of the data that's out there, that's been out there in the oil and gas industry for decades, and that only about 5% of it is used really on a daily basis for making energy efficiency decisions and actions. There's resistance to that, obviously. You know, people are used to doing things a certain way, and organizations are nervous about trusting new data systems, perhaps. Where do you see that going? I mean, are we going to see a jump and a leap of faith into sort of the new cloud-based applications of data integration and relying on those, obviously, to make decisions on efficiencies?
Yeah, first of all, I think that the COVID experience has given us, we've seen how quickly we have been able to work remotely and to use different technologies to deliver services, to do lots of things. So I think that the trust in the digital systems has gone up during this period. But yes, all the value in the whole value chain, there is potential to take out efficiencies, more automation, more robotization, less people involved. But I think the biggest gain would be to being able to use the data so that we don't have to design systems for the peak, so we can average more out both on the usage but also on the supply of energy. And that will make us able to make much more energy efficient and cost efficient energy systems.
Yeah, I mean, the intermittency issue in the electricity system, which really, that's what I suppose we have some technology solutions to help with that, but we haven't really had yet the disruptive tech tool to solve that. And of course, that would make the world of difference and uptake in that sort of source.
Just having solar panel or wind turbines I can turn after the wind or after the sun, right? Make them more useful for more hours during the day. So, I mean, just that is a very easy picture of how digital tools can contribute.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of R&D is going into that, and more being encouraged. I mean, you mentioned the value chain there. I'd like to just ask you, perhaps we can end on this point and just look at this bigger, and again, go back to a bigger picture question this year with COVID and trade being disrupted, etc., and supply chains. I mean, that's been a big question and problem for across different sectors, not just the energy sector, but obviously the energy sector in all its shapes and forms relies on a global supply chain, which a lot of which has been disrupted this year, and we've seen a move to perhaps countries learning their lessons, saying, hang on, we've got to get a little bit more nationally independent and producing that we need. Do you think that's going to trigger a more insular strategy of manufacturing within the sector, and obviously that was going to lead to perhaps higher costs because the competition will drop, or not? Where do you think manufacturing will do?
I was more concerned about this in the beginning of this period. So because there was a lot of questions whether they will function, the supply chains, but I feel that has kind of gone away a little bit, and that somehow we have managed global trade to work, seemingly anyway, more or less okay, even though there are delays and maybe not everything reaches the market the way it should. But I think that concern is less now than it was 3, 4, 5 months ago. I think that's my impression.
Yeah. And Liv, before we let you go, I want to ask you to have a sort of forward looking over the horizon viewpoint, if we can ask you to do that, looking ahead to next year and the next sort of 5 to 10 years in terms of the energy transition. And if you had to pick one thing on your wish list that you would hope to make more progress, or something that we're not seeing that you would see help make this transition towards our Paris agreement goals, what would that be?
So there are great progress going on the renewable side. There's great progress going on the digital side, and also on the electricity. What I wish could have more progress was on carbon capture and storage, because we need to do something on that side of the system as well. So that's what I would wish, more CCS.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Liv Hovem, CEO of DNV Oil and Gas, thank you very much for joining us today on our 2-minute warning interview, and we look forward to catching up with you again very soon.
Thank you for having me.